we understand if you get something wrong. We get that. We don't like that, but we get it. Everybody makes mistakes. And so the key is we have discussions with them. What did you learn from this? What would you do differently next time? And then the goal is when we send you out into the wild and you get to practice journalism for, say, the Lawrence Journal World or the Kansas City Star, you work the kinks out of the system. Related to this, I am a little bit concerned about the state of legal protections for student journalism right now, beyond the shield protection context. And I say that because it is settled First Amendment law going back to the 1960s at the US Supreme Court that students, including student journalists, have lesser free speech protections than do adults in non-school settings. So the classic case in this area is from 1968, and it is an anti-Vietnam case involving a woman named Mary Beth Tinker. The case name is Tinker v. Des Moines. Mary Beth Tinker and friends went to high school in Des Moines, and they went for several days wearing black armbands with the peace symbol on the armband. Principal came around one day and said that this public school is no place for you to express your political dissent. And Mary Beth and friends said, it is. This is the very place where we can express our political dissent. This ends up going to the US Supreme Court, and the central question is, what kind of free speech rights does a student have in a public school? And the US Supreme Court came back with one of its more emphatic classic pronouncements about free speech and said that your free speech rights don't end at the schoolhouse gate. However, it did go on to say that schools, and I think this is perfectly reasonable, schools do have a legitimate interest in maintaining the operations and efficiency of their school systems. So we should be able to create reasonable rules that govern the way our curriculum operates, the way students interact with teachers. And they said for those reasons, students are subject to more speech restrictions than an adult would be outside of a school environment. And I think that makes complete sense. In the Tinker case, I support. The case that I think has become a bit of a problem in recent years is one from 1988. And it's called Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer, and it is from Missouri, from Hazelwood, Missouri. The Hazelwood case involved a public high school that had a curricular newspaper. So student journalists would sign up for a journalism class, and as students in that class, they would produce a newspaper. And they would be student journalists interviewing people. The principal objected to several stories that were going to be published in the Hazelwood paper. One story had to do with teenage pregnancy, and the other story had to do with divorce rates among parents in that school system. And the principal said, I think this is unseemly, and we ought not run this in the paper. The student paper looks at Tinker and says, well, we have the right to talk about political and controversial issues, as the 1968 Tinker case makes clear. And the court in 1988 said, not quite. We are distinguishing Tinker. We think it's different. And we think that if you are a curricular newspaper in a public school, you are subject to greater restrictions than would be the ordinary student in a public school. So you've got the threshold that a public student is more restricted, and then you go beyond that if you are part of a curricular newspaper. And the standard that the Supreme Court articulated was this. If you are a curricular paper, administrators have the legal authority to regulate the content of your paper as long as the regulation is reasonable, has a pedagogical justification for it, is content neutral, and otherwise that publication has not been declared by the school to be a public forum. And a public forum is a legal term of art that simply means that a physical space or some other kind of space has been dedicated by a government authority for expressive purposes. So that would be if the University of Kansas would issue a proclamation declaring that the University Daily Kansan is a public forum. That would mean that this is a sacrosanct First Amendment protected venue for speech. And in the Hazelwood case, they said the administrators had not done that with that local paper, so it was subject to administrative regulation. So I bring up that case because it has been used a lot to restrict student journalists. And it was couched in terms of high school journalism. And if you read the case, you will find a lot of language in there about the immaturity of and delicate nature of high school students. And the theory is that because they are immature and because they are delicate, it is up to the administration to control the speech that would be appropriate for them. So I mention that because Hazelwood was silent on the issue of whether it should be applied to college student papers. There is a footnote in the case that refers to college journalism. And the footnote says, we're not deciding that issue now. And so the Supreme Court has never decided it. And in the one case that actually presented the issue, they punted on it. Since then, 4 federal courts of appeal covering 16 states have applied Hazelwood at the college level, using the same kind of immaturity and delicate butterfly rationale that the court applied to the high school level. Now, I think that is a profoundly dangerous thing to do. Yes, and unfortunately, this is the trend. The last case to do that was in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a circuit that I have done some work in that covers the 4 states around Ohio. So it's Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. And that was about 1.5 years ago. And before that, we had 3 come down in the course of about 10 years. So if there is an identifiable trend in this area, that is it, that we are seeing more and more federal courts of appeal use Hazelwood at the college level. And for the same reasons I just mentioned to you before, I think that's bad policy, if not bad law, because we have student journalists contributing more and more to public discourse in their communities. We can't at the same time say to them, we can't say on the one hand that you're doing good, meaningful work, you're helping to inform your communities, and on the other hand say, oh, and by the way, while you're doing that, we are actually going to reduce the First Amendment protections that your professional counterparts get when they do the same thing. That's just, I closed in an article that I wrote about this for The Atlantic with a reference to Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas. And Ann Richards made the very now famous claim that, oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the details here. Oh God, it was the Fred Astaire line. Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels. And I made the claim that, if you want to draw out the analogy here, we're asking student journalists to do the same thing. It's that we're saying, we want you to do all the same things, but we're going to make it harder for you. That to me is just so nonsensical. Now you may wonder, well, what can we do about this? The good news is there is a legislative effort afoot to draft, to get bills passed at the state level that would create greater protections for student journalists. And that instead of applying the Hazelwood standard to student journalists, it would apply the Tinker standard. And the Tinker standard is much more protective of speech. It essentially says that student speech is protected unless it creates a material and substantial disruption to school activities. There have been about 15 to 16 states that have taken up bills like that in the last year alone. Kansas has had one on the books for decades. We are actually a leader in this area. Kansas's law came about, it was in the 1980s, and it applies Tinker standards to student journalism. Another thing that I think we can do would be to, and I guess this is something we can't do, this is something that we would hope the federal courts would do, that they would stop applying Hazelwood in the manner in which they have been in the last 5 to 7 years. And finally, I think that organizations like the Student Press Law Center, and these are efforts in which I have not been involved, so I'll just disclose that now, that this is I think these are great, but they show that I don't have my fingerprints on these at all. They have begun to drill down into questions of among students, who are the least likely to speak out on certain issues, and who are the most likely to be censored. And what the Student Press Law Center has found is, on both questions, the least likely to speak out and the most likely to be censored are the most vulnerable populations at these schools. They are girls as opposed to boys, and they are minorities in terms of race and ethnic and national origins. That is quite troubling, and I think would underscore the importance of providing more generally robust speech protections. So with that being said, that is the spiel that I've got for you, and I would welcome any comments, questions, discussion. Yes?
My granddaughter is a junior in high school, copy editor on her newspaper.
Okay, great.
She knows that she knew that I was going to be here, and this is her question.
Okay.
She aspires to write. She aspires to be a journalist, but is extremely upset with what she hears the President of the United States say about journalists.
Right.
And her last night, her question to me was, why does he do that? What is it, just political? And so she wanted me to ask you this question. Yeah. What's your experience of that whole business? You're a journalist being whacked regularly.
Right. It's pretty wild. It is. I mean, every day
it's insane.
I've told friends that my daily habits have changed in the sense that every day I get up and I look at Donald Trump's Twitter feed to see what he said lately about me. And I have written. I've spent a good amount of time in the last 2 to 3 weeks being interviewed and speaking out on that very issue about press freedom under the Trump administration. And in October, so before the election, I wrote about a 1,400-word story analyzing what I thought would be the implications for press freedom of a Trump presidency. And again, that was in October, and I just thought, let's take this seriously. And then I became exceptionally popular when he actually was elected, and nobody else had written on the issue, and people kept saying, oh my God, let's read what actually could happen. So one of the things I do in that piece, and that I have done since, is I have cataloged all of the many instances in which he has made derogatory comments about the press. Whether he is referring to CNN as fake news, or referring to BuzzFeed as a failing pile of garbage, or more generally, today, as of about 45 minutes ago, the last thing that he tweeted was a story by The Federalist that is a collection of what The Federalist deemed to be bad news stories. He has threatened to sue the New York Times, the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the Daily Beast, and I mean, the list goes on. And so the question is, what does that mean for journalism? And I worry about the effect of the rhetoric, that if you cast the press as an enemy over and over again, and a significant portion of the American population believes that and buys into that, then you delegitimize the press, and you delegitimize the independence that the press depends on to exercise its freedoms under the First Amendment. So I worry both legally about what could be done, and in terms of what a Trump administration could do legally to restrict the press, there's not a lot singularly that the White House could do. A lot of what you would want to have done, you would have to go through Congress, or you would have to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. So by way of example, all of the big talk about opening up our libel laws to make it easier to sue news organizations, that's completely silly. He has no power over our libel laws whatsoever. That is a constitutionalized area of law, and that would have to go through the U.S. Supreme Court. The only way he would be able to affect libel law would be to appoint judges to the federal judiciary who could, over time, begin to chip away at traditional First Amendment principles. Neil Gorsuch, the nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court, actually has a very traditional jurisprudence on First Amendment issues. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press released a report on him about 4 or 5 days ago, analyzing what kind of justice would he be on speech and press issues, and found that he would be very much in the mainstream. So that's about the only way you can affect libel law. Let's say government transparency. that's an area where an administration has some power. You do not, as a president or as a White House, have the power to change the Freedom of Information Act, which is the federal law that enables you to go to executive branch agencies and demand government documents. You can't just come into office and say, well, the FOIA now no longer requires X, Y, and Z. That's a congressional grant of authority. What an administration can do is issue executive orders that will affect the way that executive branch officials follow the FOIA. So I'll give you one example. On, I think it was Obama's first full day in office, he issued an executive order in 2 presidential memoranda that said to all executive branch officials, when you receive a Freedom of Information Act request that is questionable, so in other words, you're not quite sure if this material is disclosable or not disclosable, I want you to err on the side of openness. So I want you to disclose it. So a president could do something like that. Now that became a lot harder over the summer because Congress passed a law that said if the president wants to reverse that presumption, the president has to go through Congress first. With the Congress that we currently have, I don't know that that would be much of a problem. I think you could probably get that done pretty quickly. Another area of law where you could actually affect the practice of journalism, it would be in the area of public affairs reporting, specifically reporting in the national security area. And so we have heard some people question, well, could you bring an Espionage Act prosecution against a journalist for publishing classified information? Because the Espionage Act, on its terms, does forbid the distribution of classified information. That has only ever happened once, and it was in 1942, and it was the Chicago Tribune. I mention that for the sake of context, that it's not impossible. You could see the Espionage Act used that way to prosecute journalists, but if history is any indicator, probably that's something that we don't need to pull our hair out about. That being said, what became much more common under President Obama, and I would see no reason that this would drop off, would be prosecutions of government whistleblowers who release the information, and then you use the journalist as the means to prosecute them. So you send the journalist the subpoena to provide the information you need to prosecute the government whistleblower. That, I think, is very likely to occur, to continue occurring.
How do you understand Trump's motivation for doing what he's doing?
I have heard a lot of different theories advanced. One would be that he doesn't believe any of it, but that he operates best when he has an enemy, and the press makes a good enemy. The other is the more, I guess, Ringling Brothers approach to publicity, that all publicity is good publicity as long as you're talking about me. So if I can stay in the press by beating up on the press, great. Another theory I've seen advanced is that perhaps he is trying to delegitimize institutions that would have the clout to affect his power. Because you've seen him systematically do that with the judiciary, with Congress, and the press. I don't know, what the real reason is. Certainly he has also surrounded himself by people who seem to have a high level of contempt for the press. And you look at a press secretary like Sean Spicer, and whether you're talking about whether he's defending alternative facts presented by Kellyanne Conway, or whether he is putting in front of you pictures of the inauguration that clearly depict something other than what he is saying they depict. I guess that concerns me. The larger, I guess, as a member of the press, selfishly, I am occasionally offended by comments he makes about the press. I'm also, having done this for 12 years now, I'm thick-skinned enough that it just kind of rolls off. The thing I worry about, though, is the more democratic effect that would have in delegitimizing an institution that is important to democracy. And I think what I care about more than attacking the press would be if that becomes a synecdoche for attacking facts and attacking truth. Yes?
Leonard Pitts proposed that the only effective opposition party in the United States at this current time is the media and the press. And the Democratic Party is in disarray and not very effective yet. And so I can understand where you might think that Trump used the press as the opposition, the enemy.
Right.
But stick to your guns, because this president is an absolute danger to the Republic of these United States. And more people are going to know that, and I'm making it my business to keep mentioning it everywhere I go.
And for that, we're grateful.
And I'm about to send my sister's friend, or my wife's sister's friend, sent her a piece, a 3-pager, that describes that she has worked with narcissistic personality disorder for most of her adult life. And she says this is what you're going to get in Trump.
It is,
And it's just absolutely, I'm about to send it to our Republican Congress people, and if they haven't already caught on, and I bet some of them are beginning to get the light, I mean, this man is absolutely incapable of changing.
right.
He's not treatable.
I've been amused by media reports about the pivot is coming, and I just think, no, the pivot's not coming. I mean, and we've said this since the primaries, that there's not.
He has never shown that in his whole life.
Right. And I would also say that Leonard Pitts, he is a really good friend of mine, and Leonard was actually my column writing instructor when I was in college. He was a visiting professional at Ohio University when I was there, and Leonard is a fantastic human being. And I'll tell you, I remember one of the more disheartening moments in my professional career. This has probably been about 10 years ago now, and I was a little bit thin-skinned then because I was quite new at this. And I would get, mail, nasty mail, and it would be email, actual mail, and I didn't quite know how to process that. And my editor kind of walked me through and said, you gotta let this roll. You can't let this eat you up. So I was talking to Leonard about it one day, and he just kind of laughed, and he said, let me show you my inbox. And, as a black man writing about race in America, just some scathing stuff. And so I really admire people like Leonard who do what they do despite the obstacles. And I share all of your concerns. And it was just this morning, about an hour and a half ago, he tweeted about Nordstrom and picked out Nordstrom as the target of his ire because Nordstrom decided not to carry one of Ivanka's lines anymore. And so I think, is this really the proper role of a president? Probably not.
How
Yeah.
are your students reacting?